be brief. It's now 8 minutes past 3. I'm hoping that I'll leave. I want you to relax mentally, because my presentation will be 1 or 2 or 3 steps down the ladder of intellectual complexity from where we have been so far today. So sit back and don't ask too much of your brains for the next few minutes. My ambition here is to explain the aims and the ideas of what I will call the web approach to human history. And I'm not going to call it a theory, and I'm not going to call it a model, because I think these terms probably are a bit too pretentious for what I have to offer. And in my title it says the first 50,000 years. To some extent, 50,000 years is an arbitrary starting point, but it is intended to represent the following. The time in human history, and maybe it was 60,000 years ago, maybe it was 30,000 years ago, I don't know. The time in human history when the human population had already migrated out of Africa and across Asia, had already made its beachhead on the Australian continent. That is, the human population was very widespread, and yet human numbers were still very small, and the degree of interaction amongst the entirety of the human population was, I'm guessing, at its absolute lowest. Because in earlier times in human history, the population was more concentrated geographically, well, within Africa, probably mainly within East and Southern Africa. And therefore, the degree of interaction amongst the entire human population, I'm guessing, was greater before the exodus from Africa. So there was a moment, maybe 50,000 years ago, when we were, as a species, maximally dispersed geographically and minimally interactive with one another. So that's what I'm intending with this 50,000 years ago starting point. And 2 more components of introduction. What I'm going to say is based on a book that I co-wrote with W.H. McNeil, who happens to be my father. And I'll answer a question now that some of you are already thinking, and many people have asked me in the past. The answer is, if you're ever thinking of writing a book with your father or mother, or with your son or daughter, my suggestion is that you think long and hard about this. It's a bit like climbing a Himalayan mountain, something that you may in the end be glad to have done, but you will find painful for most every step of the way. I knew you were curious about that, so I thought I'd answer it. The last bit of introduction is my answer to the question, does history evolve? And like David Christian and like Khaled Hakami, I think the answer is yes. My answer may be a little bit different in how it evolves, and it is yes so far. It evolves in at least the following respects. One is that over time, human population has grown. 2, and these are interconnected. 2, over time, the harnessed energy, the deployed energy of the human population, both in absolute terms and in per capita terms, has grown. And thirdly, the amount of information in circulation within human societies has grown. This is related, I think, perhaps to David Christian's collective learning concept. And, more specifically to my presentation, the networks of interaction among human individuals, among human societies, have grown in their geographical extent, in the intensity of their interactions, and in the complexity of the networks themselves. All of these may be forms of complexity, depending on how you understand that term, which I will not attempt to define for you. Okay. The first aim of the web approach was and is to present human history in a way that is simple to understand. I share the frustration that many people do, that historians are focused on whatever it was that Pierce said, nationalism in some small corner of the Netherlands in 1703 and 1704.
Some aspects.
Some aspects, yes. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get it too broad. This has been a frustration to me for some years, even though I have contributed to that sin myself on more than one occasion. So I wanted to try to come up with a presentation of the whole of human history that would be simple to understand. And I knew that I had a natural ally in this, in my father, who had for many decades been trying to make sense of human history and had presented it in an influential fashion when I was a little child, in a big, thick book that takes a couple of weeks to read. So, in addition to an understandable and reasonably simple vision of human history, there's a second aim in providing this web approach, and that was brevity. I wanted the book that we ultimately wrote to be only 200 pages long, which was about the length of a very successful book by Stephen Hawking called A Brief History of Time. So I thought if Stephen Hawking could put the history of the universe into 200 pages, I ought to be able to put the history of humankind into 200 pages. But unfortunately, I recruited my father as a co-author, and that ruined the plan, and the book ended up at 324 pages. And that is his fault, I assure you. So, brevity and simplicity. A third aim was to provide a vision of the history of the world that was truly global, which in this day and age seems to be essential. I think it's no longer acceptable to present the history of the world as is often done, at least in the United States, as the history of Western civilization with a few things added on at various moments. This is, I think, not only intellectually unacceptable, but politically irresponsible. And it still happens, to my regret. So that was a third aim. And I was encouraged in this by the comment of the New Zealand physicist whose name has already been raised this morning. That's Ernest Rutherford. This must be the only conference or symposium ever devoted to history and evolution at which Ernest Rutherford has been brought up twice. Well, what I like about Ernest Rutherford is that he apparently said, somewhere around 1912, that all good physics should be comprehensible to a barmaid. And my view is that it should be possible to present a vision of human history that is comprehensible to let us say not a barmaid, but to an 18-year-old undergraduate with no particular intellectual pretensions or distinctions. So, those are the aims behind the creation of this approach. Now, before I tell you any more about what it is, I want to show you some maps which help in a general way get across the idea. These maps were made by an archaeologist named Andrew Chiara, who died a little more than a year ago, too young. He worked at the Ashmolean Museum. And he was interested in the integration of human societies, what he sometimes called world systems, and what some people sometimes call proto-globalization. So what I'll do now is show you the maps that Chiara made. I'll make a few comments on some of them as we go along. And this will visually convey something of the idea that I will then try to put into words more precisely. So, Chiara's first map is 5,000 years ago, and he's interested particularly in trade, but I will use this as a proxy for all kinds of interaction. And you can see, in his view, in the first instance, the most interactive part of the human community is that of Southwest Asia and Egypt. And we move forward in time. It's the same pattern, just a little bit more extensive. We move forward in time. Same pattern, a little bit more extensive, but the sea is more deeply involved. Here the pattern shifts a little bit because there's an East Asian network of interaction emerging by 1500 BC, and also the tentacles of this web, as I want to call it, have begun to extend more deeply into Europe. But there's also been some retreat in Central Asia and North India. Same general pattern, just a bit more extensive. And then a quantum leap in the extent of this set of networks of interaction. And let's back up just a moment. Here, 1000 BC, the East Asian system and the West Eurasian, Afro-Eurasian system are separate. But by 500 BC, they've almost merged. And by AD 1, not only is the system much more extensive with many more links, but the whole system has fused into one huge network. And also the reach into Africa has grown considerably. The pattern basically the same, but more extensive and intensive. And here the maritime linkages across the Indian Ocean have come into play, and the extension of this system into sub-Saharan Africa, into northernmost Europe, even Iceland and Greenland. Japan has also entered in, may have entered in, no, between 500 and 1,000. Japan is also enlisted in this growing web. And then Chiara's final map, AD 1500, there are a few tentacles that reach over the horizon. I suppose they're going to reach to America, but he didn't draw that in. And Chiara didn't draw another map. He stopped in 1500. He's an archaeologist. the last few centuries perhaps are less interesting to him than they are to me. But as you'll hear me say in due course, the pattern in the last 500 years is one of, again, greater intensification and extensification of this network of webs. So, thank you to Andrew Sherratt. I wish he were still alive. The webs are an abstraction. They are something that no written record attests to. No archaeologist can dig one up out of the ground. They are, I sometimes say, the dark matter of history. You know that the astronomers believe that the universe has lots of dark matter in it, stuff that they can't see, they cannot detect directly with their instruments, but they know, or at least they think they know, I'm prepared to believe them, that it's there because of observable effects, gravitational effects, on other things that can be directly observed. So history is full of dark matter, things that neither texts nor archaeological evidence can directly attest to, but which we can reasonably say must be there, must have been there, because of observable effects on things that we can observe directly. Now, historians tend not to like dark matter. David Christian, I think, was alluding to some of the same things. He used a different vocabulary. But if historians only write about the things that can be directly attested to by written evidence or by archaeological evidence, then I think we will miss a large part of the story, and probably blind ourselves to broader patterns of historical evolution. So, let me back up a few thousand years. This is Sherratt's first map, but I'm going to begin with what I call local webs. Maybe 20,000 years ago, maybe 15,000 years ago, as in certain places of the world, favored ecosystems, populations grew less mobile and more sedentary and began to interact in larger numbers, larger than a typical mobile hunter-gatherer band, which might be 30, 50, 60 people. And ultimately, probably along seacoasts more often than anywhere else, larger communities, local webs of interaction involving hundreds, probably thousands of people emerged. It's hard to say where this really happened. Most of the places where it happened are probably now underwater. Because of the melting of the last glaciation. Oops. These are some of the hypothetical characteristics of these initial local webs involving only, at the most, a few thousands of people. Well, fast forward 10,000 years, and in certain parts of the world, agriculture and the beginning of cities, something that I tend to regard as one of the great turning points in the human experience. And eventually, with the rise of cities, first in Mesopotamia, but not long thereafter elsewhere in Southwest Asia and North Africa, with the rise of cities arose what I call metropolitan webs, networks of interaction involving both the urban populations and the agrarian populations of their hinterlands, villages, now tens of thousands of people, maybe eventually hundreds of thousands of people, in one interactive system that might extend a few hundred kilometers in some directions from a key central urban point. And depending on geography and rivers and so forth, the shape of this metropolitan web would likely be quite uneven. Then, eventually, after more centuries of population growth and technological change, particularly in the transport sector, the various metropolitan webs of that space between Morocco and Japan began to, as it were, fill in the gaps and make connections from one metropolitan web to another, to the point where, about 2,000 years ago, I guess, the whole system became interactive in some significant senses, as Sherratt's map of 1 AD indicated, and as the Roman naturalist Pliny implied when he wrote the following words. He apparently was a real curmudgeon, ungenerous character, as you'll understand shortly. We have now come to see whole mountains cut down to marble slabs, journeys made to China to get stuffs for clothing, the abysses of the Red Sea explored for pearls, and the depths of the earth in search for emeralds. Nay, more, they have taken up the notion, they means women in Rome, they have taken up the notion of piercing their ears, as if it were not enough to wear these gems in necklaces, but that holes are made in the body to insert them in. And at the lowest calculation, India, China, and Arabia together drain our empire of 100 million sesterces every year. That's the Roman money. That is the price that our luxuries and our womankind cost us. Well, Pliny apparently was a proto-mercantilist, and he was worried about the exodus of money, and he was clearly a misogynist. He thought that Roman women were responsible for these unfortunate developments. And for those of you who find that offensive, you'll be glad to know that he died a horrible death in AD 79 when the Vesuvius volcano erupted. Pliny was among the victims. But at any rate, that quotation captures two things. One is the existence of a pan-Eurasian web as of Pliny's lifetime. And it also captures regret at the existence of this, probably for reasons that would be different from those that most people who experienced the enlargement of webs would feel. But at any rate, dissatisfaction with this particular piece of evolution. So, in my view, my father's view, after the 15th and 16th century, after the maritime link-ups of all the inhabited continents, then there is increasingly only one web on the face of the earth. Prior to the 15th, 16th century, there had been at least two. One that I've shown you in these maps, and another one, a smaller one in terms of its spatial extent and the numbers of human beings involved, in the Americas. Quite separate. But interestingly, it had evolved in roughly parallel ways. At any rate, after the 16th century, these were joined, and soon thereafter, the smaller and rather less interactive zone of Polynesia was also incorporated into this one global web in which we still live today, and in which almost everybody participates. There are some populations, and Khaled actually has lived with one of them, that is probably almost completely still outside the web, these hunter-gatherers in southern Thailand. But there are very few such people outside, less than 1/100th of 1% of the human population, I would estimate. So, in some sense, what this is simply a history of a long, slow, but accelerating process of globalization. It is a vision of history that emphasizes or privileges transportation technology, emphasizes the role of communication and information and of cities. And I think it reveals something interesting about the relationship between two kinds of societal evolution. One which we might call parallel development, and one which we might call interactive development. Allow me to explain a little bit what I mean by these. In the Americas and in the Afro-Eurasian sphere, at some point, a transition to agriculture, actually more than one, was made. Equally, states were created, and so were cities, and so were societies led by, ruled by warrior elites, sometimes in alliance with religious elites. These things happened in parallel in the Americas and in the Afro-Eurasian world, with no reference to one another before AD 1492, at least. This was parallel development. Kind of interesting that it followed broadly similar evolutionary patterns. But as time goes on, as we get closer to the present, there's less and less parallel evolution in human history, and more interactive evolution. That is, historical change that arises on account of diffusion or challenge and response, as Pierre put it, or, as I more blandly put it, contact and interaction. So that, at the present, I would say, there's virtually no historical change that is not a result of interactive pressures. Nothing happens now without reference to large parts of the rest of the world. Now, you might ask at this point, well, there are many things you might ask, such as when does this lecture end, but you might ask, why do these webs grow in spatial extent and grow in their complexity and in their intensity? There are a couple of reasons, I think. One is that what David Christian calls collective learning happens particularly in the sphere of technology, so that new transportation technologies and new communications technologies are at some point invented and spread, and this has a cumulative character to it. More is invented and spread than is lost over time. So the capacity to interact over broader and broader spaces grows over time. It may also be that the people involved, some of them, want this to happen. There could be some intentionality, even though the people are entirely unconscious of webs of history. But for those already involved in a web, particularly their leadership, may find it advantageous to try to extend the size of the operation. As long as there's an upward flow, that is, from the lower ranks of society to the leadership ranks of society, an upward flow of goods and prestige and deference, then the more people that can be enrolled in this, the better, from the point of view of the people at the top. So just as the default position of kings is to try to expand their kingdom, and the default position of business CEOs is to try to expand their business, the people in any kind of institution and organization that's involved in a highly interactive part of the globe has incentive to extend the reach of interaction into the less well-populated, the less complexly organized parts of the human community. It can also be that those less well or less complexly organized societies, let's say they're hunter-gatherers in Siberia, they too may have some degree of social hierarchy within their society, and some people, maybe those at the top, maybe those at the bottom, may find it advantageous to accept association with, let's say, accept trade relationships with encroaching Russians, in this case. The Yukagir people, for example, of Siberia, some of them voluntarily participated in the fur trade with the Russians in the 15th and 16th century. Now, this was disastrous for the Yukagir as a whole. They got diseases. At least half of the population disappeared within 2 human generations. And they were gradually stripped of most of their Yukagir culture, gradually became speakers of different language, followers of a different religion. Their social customs almost entirely disappeared and become more Russianized over the centuries. For Yukagir culture, this was a disaster. But for some people within the Yukagir community, it seemed like a good idea at the time. They may have regretted it before they died, and maybe their grandchildren regret it, but it could be that their great-great-great-grandchildren are happier to be within Russia than they were they back in some no longer existing Yukagir hunting and gathering society. So I imagine some people find involvement in one of these webs regrettable, some find it desirable. And there's no doubt differences of opinion and conflict as a result. Now, I want to emphasize that even though I say on this slide that there's no escape, there's a question mark after that. Historically, it seems to me that even though there is, I believe, a demonstrable evolution towards larger and larger webs of interaction, there have been temporary and local, might even say regional, reverses in this process. It does not seem to me necessarily teleological. It could be that this pattern, while I think it is held for thousands of years, is not necessarily going to extend indefinitely into the future. It requires some active imagination, I think, to think of something that could reverse it, but this is always the case. People at any point in the past imagine that current trends are going to proceed more or less as they are. It's always impossible to expect to anticipate a big change. But I think we have to realize that it is at least conceivable. Now, if I'm not out of time, I'll mention a couple of the weaknesses. Am I out of time? No.
Not yet.
All right. Some weaknesses that I see in this approach that I'm offering. And some of these have been pointed out to me by helpfully minded colleagues and students. One is that in trying to present a picture of the whole, it may be too global and too brief. Indeed, my co-author tended to think this at many times, and when we were done, he pointed out that even though I had written several sentences about the last cultural Tasmanian, a woman whose name apparently was Trucanini, the chapter which I was primarily responsible for, that dealt with more modern history, did not mention either Bismarck or Churchill. And he, and many other people, might reasonably object that a history that mentions Trucanini but does not mention Bismarck or Churchill is missing something important. Now, I argued against that, and I thought that Trucanini is important because her life and her death indicate something about what happened to Tasmanians, what happened to people such as the Yukagirs who were enlisted, enrolled, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, into this ever larger web. But I understand the objection. And when I teach world history, I hasten to assure you that I do mention Bismarck and Churchill. Another responsible objection to this is that it's all about the material side of human history. And I think that's substantially true, not entirely true, because this web of interaction, or I should say the webs of history, do also convey artistic styles and religious ideas and other non-material components of the human experience. But I have to admit, in the book that ultimately was published, that these things do get very short shrift. So I don't think it's necessarily a defect of the web approach, even if I confess it is a defect of the way that I and my father presented it. Well, there are probably many inconsistencies and compromises in the book because there are two authors. Some of them, when I read the book, I find very irritating. Others, I'm sure my father finds very irritating. But I won't point them out to you. I'll instead invite you to read the book and find what irritates you in it. And you can let me know at your leisure. Now, I want to close by offering a thought experiment which occurred to me as I was listening to the earlier speakers today. And it, I think, may help us focus our understanding of what we believe about whether or not history evolves, and if so, how. Here's the thought experiment. Somebody objects to me, it's only insect life, but imagine that more than 6 billion of us were kidnapped by space aliens and removed to another galaxy. And there were only 500 people left, and they were hunter-gatherers in Amazonia. But let's say they were also healthy and were reproducing pretty satisfactorily. What would happen? How would history evolve from this point forward? Would tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years pass with hunter-gatherer societies, perhaps radiating adaptively into various ecological niches, first in South America and then North America, and then maybe if they figured out how to cross the seas, other continents. Would a transition to agriculture ever take place? Would states ever evolve? Etc., etc., etc. Now, I don't know the answer to this, but here's what I would guess. One, that sooner or later there would be transitions to agriculture. And if there were transitions to agriculture, I would guess that sooner or later there would be states. Now, I don't think that the Roman Empire would evolve again. I think that's extremely improbable. But I do think that it is likely that, if given enough time, that some of the basic patterns of the last 20,000 years would, in approximate terms, reproduce themselves. That is, history would evolve in ways that, if those who had been removed to another galaxy could live long enough to see it, would seem broadly familiar. That's my guess. But I invite you to conduct your own thought experiments, and if you like, to contest mine. Thank you very much.
Well, I suggest everyone ask questions to John with regard to does history evolve, and those who want some family counseling on how to deal with your father, meet him this evening. Let's keep these things separate during the conversation. Yes.
Just a very short question. Sorry. Very short. You mentioned
It's done.
Yes.
BC and BP. Does the letter refer to an oil company, or what does it mean? Thank you.
I'm sorry, this is an inconsistency that I can't blame on having a co-author. This is entirely my own fault. BP means before the present. It does not mean British Petroleum. So it's 2,000 years different from BC.
Are there any other questions?
I like easy ones like that, by the way.
I have a question on what constitutes exactly a web. So, first of all, how large do the populations need to be before you can actually speak of a web? If different communities exchange ideas or goods? And second of all, what is it exactly that they need to come to exchange? Does it have to be ideas or maybe goods or both? And finally, how much do they need to exchange before you can say this is actually part of the web? So that would be my question.
That is a very sensible question that a good barmaid would instantly ask. The answer is that the terminology is at root arbitrary. But I would say that to qualify as a web, a community, an interacting community, has to be bigger than the typical hunter-gatherer band, which I understand to be around 30 to 50 people, which I take to be the basic social cellular structure of the human species. Not the family, but the band. So I could say that anything larger than a family counts as a web, but I arbitrarily say no, it has to be larger than that, at least a few hundred people. Second part of your question is what things have to be exchanged and communicated for this to qualify. Again, the concept is unfortunately imprecise and fuzzy, and the answer is arbitrary. But I would say, to qualify some of the above, ideas, goods, genes, that is, having sex, and microorganisms, that is, communicating diseases. At least some of those four broad categories of things. And if it's only one of those four categories, does that qualify as a web? Maybe yes, maybe no. It is at root a fuzzy concept, but I like to think many useful concepts are fuzzy.
You said at the beginning you would like to refrain from putting models, but maybe I would try to catch some kind of a model here. Now at the beginning of so I apologize. At the beginning of your talk, you said that you do see human evolution in the terms of information gathering and energy, and even to connectivity. However, when you try to find the reasons for the growing of the web, you specifically mentioned the accumulation of knowledge and human will and intentions. What about the role of energy in building and expanding webs? Or available energy for humans in order to expand their webs?
I also mentioned technology, communications and transportation technology. And I think that in connection with technology, growing command over growing quantities of energy is a factor, among other factors, in the tendency for webs to expand and merge. And you might also say that the human intentionality that I referred to is also connected to this, because ultimately, what is it that people are trying to capture and get their hands on? Some cases it's human labor, some cases it's animals, food supplies. These are, of course, forms of energy. So I think you can say that the concept of energy, which I think is another fuzzy concept, at least in the English language, permeates this approach, which I'm not calling a model.
I think we've got time for one last question. It would not be fair for the last speaker to take away his time. So.
Okay. Which one do you say?
Whoever has the easiest question.
What mistakes did you find?
Perhaps I wanted to ask whether the human race has got new ears and new eyes. Is a type of evolution that was not there 500 years ago, or when all the networks started to evolve. I mean, the human race can now look into the universe and they can hear somebody play in Latin America or in America itself, and that was not the case ever before. Is that also part of the evolution of history?
The human race has acquired new ears and eyes, metaphorically speaking. That is the ability to see through electronic media and to hear through electronic media things that are going on in far distant parts of the world. Yes, yes, yes. This is a manifestation, and probably a very important manifestation, of the intensification of the contemporary human web. Indeed, the electrification of the human web, so that information now circulates more or less instantaneously. And this is very new, only a few decades old, and the extent of its consequences, just how revolutionary this might be, is much, 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 much too soon to tell. But I would guess, among the many other guesses I've hazarded this afternoon, that in the fullness of time, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, we will come to see this electrification of the human web as a revolutionary moment. But I'll be dead, so you can't contest that one with me.
Well, let's stop with this joyful comment. We have a break of some 20 minutes, which means exactly 20 minutes, and then we continue for the last presentation, and then immediately after the presentation there will be a discussion, and immediately after the discussion there will be drinks, so everything will turn out fine.
Yes.